Well, good morning, Redemption. It's good to see y'all. I want to give away the plot. So if you're wondering what in the world this sermon is all about, it is this. A Jesus-centered life is a life where Jesus transforms our resentment and turns it into gratitude. We could wrap it up here, but we won't, because there's lots that needs to be said. Particularly to a room full of people who I know exist in a world where you have been told, most likely at some level, that, hey, you should just be okay with the bad things that happen to you because you believe in Jesus, right? Like you believe in Jesus, and so you just need to kind of buck up and chin up and look on the bright side of life. Everything's going to be fine. You believe in Jesus, right? So all the bad things that happen to you really aren't bad things. In fact, those bad things are probably God's will for you. This is what God really wanted for you. And so there's a lot that needs to be said. Because my sermon this morning is not the message that God is telling you to look on the bright side of life. My sermon this morning is not that you just need to count your blessings, to have a different sort of outlook, that you just need to change your mindset. I'll leave that for my life coaching on Instagram. Follow me at, just kidding. I think we will find in this story that we're actually revisiting. We started the beginning of this series that we're in a Jesus-centered life with this story a few months ago. And so we're coming back to it. And we find on the first day of Easter, the first Easter day ever, there are two men traveling to a small town outside of Jerusalem. We learn that these two men are disciples of Jesus, and they're leaving the city where all of their hopes and dreams for God's great future of what the world would be have been crucified. That all that they were believing that God was going to give them had been put to death. That all of their expectations for what God had promised them was killed. They even say later on in their explanation of everything that had happened to Jesus himself, ironically, we had believed that he was the one that was going to redeem Israel. And the implied idea there is that, well, he's obviously not. We find in Luke chapter 24, if you want to turn there with me this morning, you're welcome to. There's a Bible in your seats in front of you. You can also open one up on your phone. We'll have it up for you on the screen if you're already in vacation mode. And we skip down to verse 15, where it says that while these two were talking and discussing and journeying, Jesus himself approached and began to travel with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are these words that you're exchanging with one another as you're walking?" And they came to a stop, looking sad. You can imagine all that they were carrying as they talked amongst themselves. I think many of us felt something similar to this a couple of weeks ago on the heels of an election that went very differently than many of us believed and went very differently than many of us had hoped. I think they can share in some of your angst. For those of you that feel like your very existence is a threat, is being undermined, I think that they can understand this. Their Messiah had been killed. They had been very closely associated with him. Were they next? Were the Romans about to go, or the Jewish leaders about to go in and round everyone up known to associate with this Jesus and do to them what they had just done to him? But on top of all of this, imagine their grief. They had expected that life was going to go a certain way, that God's certain future was right there. They're on the brink of it, on the cusp. And darkness prevails. Their grief and their loss in this moment. And unbeknownst to them, Jesus shows up and asks them, "What in the world are y'all talking about?" And they can't help but stop. And in this moment, their bodies betray what was going on in their hearts. I imagine they stopped and they looked down and they just enfleshed sadness. So this morning, I want to ask us a question that came to me at the hands of a poor nurse who had been assigned to do some treatment for my dear wife, Gabby. She came into our living room. She had been working there a week, had no idea what she was doing, and so found herself very nervous and very chatty. And I owe a great deal of this sermon to her, because in the course of conversation, she was talking about rearing her 3 or 4 children. And she talked about the difference in raising them as kids who are deeply loved versus raising them as kids who feel like they need to survive. And she had talked about the difference between herself and her ex-husband. And her ex-husband grew up as a survivalist, and she wanted to raise her children in some sort of different environment where they didn't see everything around them as a threat. And the difference here is, as a survivalist, you feel like the world is out to get you. That everything is opposed to you, and you have to figure out how to pull yourself up by your bootstraps to make it in this world. Survivalism is deeply tied to the American dream. If you have, it's because you've earned it. You've deserved it. If you do not have, well, clearly you're lazy. At least that's something like the narrative we hear. But we compare this with the life of someone who grows up believing deep down in their core of their being that they are deeply loved. They grow up not in fear, not in shame, not in having to prove themselves in one way or the other, but with the knowledge that no matter what, no matter how successful or how much of a failure they are loved. I want to acknowledge that we all begin our journey with Jesus as survivalists. I think we're born into this world as survivalists. I think we believe deeply in our limbic system that it's up to us to survive, that no one's going to do it for us, that we are on our own. And I want to point to 5 principles that betray our tendency to want to be survivalist in the world, things that come out of our survivalism. The first is this: when we are survivalists, we are people of scarcity. See, we never quite know if we'll ever really have enough, and so we always focus on what we don't have. We always focus on the next thing that we need that's not here yet. We focus on our lack. Number 2, when we're survivalists, we are bitter. In a world of scarcity, where all we can see is what we lack, we begin to resent the lives that we actually have. Resent the fact that life didn't turn out differently. Our walls of bitterness turn our hearts cold as everyone and everything around us becomes a threat or our competition. Number 3, we're survivalists, or as survivalists, we are exploiters. With everyone a threat or a competition, relationships become utilitarian, instrumental. They exist for my security or for my getting what I need. People become a means to an end, and relationships are defined by what have you done for me lately, and what will you do for me tomorrow. Number 4, when we are survivalist, we are judgmental. Because relationships are utilitarian and instrumental, we see and define people by their deficits, by what's not there, by what they don't or are unable to offer us. And so we determine that their worth to us is based on our judgment of what they may or may not bring to our lives. And when we are survivalist, finally, we are isolated. Living in a world of scarcity where you can never have enough, where everyone is a threat or competition, where relationships are primarily utilitarian, and we define people's worth based on their deficits, we live with our walls up. And everything around us is a threat. I can imagine these 2 men are in something like this sort of place. As they leave Jerusalem, trying to figure out what the heck they're going to do with their lives now, discussing amongst themselves what the heck just happened. They're in a place that Henry Nouwen calls the place of resentment. Much of this sermon comes from his book, With Burning Hearts, where he talks about this passage in Luke. And he says this here: when we are hit by one loss after another, it's very easy to become disillusioned, angry, bitter, and increasingly resentful. And so the older we become, the greater is our temptation to say, life has cheated me. There is no future for me. Nothing to hope for. We call this a midlife crisis, by the way. I wouldn't know anything about it, y'all. I'm like 23, so. He goes on, the only thing to do is to defend the little bit that I have left so that I won't lose it all. Resentment is one of the most destructive forces in our lives. It is cold anger that has settled into the center of our being and hardened our hearts. Resentment can become a way of life that so pervades our words and actions that we no longer recognize it as such. He concludes that it is such an obvious response to our many losses. And the tragedy is that much resentment is hidden within the church. And it's one of the most paralyzing aspects of the Christian community. Right? His point here is not that we will not experience loss. His point is that what loss does to us is it, if I can use my words, it dehumanizes you. It tries to tell you your losses, your grief, your pain that has been inflicted on you by the powers and the sin and the darkness of this world are trying to tell you that you are not lovable, that you are not safe, that you are not cared for. And so you better put your walls up, let your heart be stone, and go and fight for your life. Survivalists. And these men have every right to be resentful, to be jaded, to be cynical and bitter. No one can blame them for being in survival mode in their grief. And no one ought to blame anyone for being in survival mode in your grief. Their hope had just been crucified. Can you imagine? And the worst part was they were left alive, left standing, left to pick up the pieces and figure out how in the world am I supposed to survive in a loveless and cold world like this now? And I wonder if, for many of us, this sounds all too familiar. I wonder if many of you find yourselves grieving. Find yourselves with so little to be thankful for as we head into another quote unquote Thanksgiving, because I guess we're supposed to. Maybe even feeling like God has abandoned you. That God has not delivered on what God promised you. I wonder if you, like them, feel like you are left to figure out how to pick up the pieces on your own. After an election that didn't go your way, after a relationship that was meant to be one of love and delight deteriorated into a source of pain and hatred, after the faith that once used to hold you up has let you down, after your last decision to once again love yourself in spite of your neighbor, I wonder if you feel a little bit alone this morning, a little bit on your own to figure it out. Like them, how in the world do I survive in a loveless, cold world like this? These men begin their journey, as we all do, as survivalists, believing we have to scratch and claw and fight our way towards life. This is survival of the fittest, baby. You better be fit. This fall, we explored what it meant for God to be at work in our world to make all things new. You can go back and listen to these. We began in September. We concluded that because God is at work to make all things new, we are a radically inclusive community of hope, and that our work in response to what God is doing is to lead Jesus-centered lives. And we find that a Jesus-centered life is essentially a life of communion. Some would say a Eucharistic life, which literally means thanksgiving, a life of worship, a life where God's future is enacted, is lived out, is embraced in the present, a life where we are caught up in God's very self in such a way that we are transformed into lovers of God and lovers of neighbor. As Leslie Newbigin, the theologian, puts it, the church exists as a sign and foretaste of God's kingdom. And so Redemption Church, Jesus is inviting us to be the thing that points to and is a glimpse, a foretaste of God's kingdom come. And I know what many of you are asking right now. How in the world am I supposed to do that? In my grief, in my pain, in my just trying to figure out how to make it to tomorrow. And so we're going to wrap this series up with this sermon. I know I introduced the sermon in the middle of the sermon, which is sort of weird, but I'm artsy, so deal with it. And I think it's appropriate for us to be having this conversation on the brink of a season that's supposed to be filled with joy. And all the Hallmark stuff with the warm gingerbread cookies in the oven, and we're coming home with the Folgers, and it's so good. And yet the reality is always never that. It's arguments with our family members. It's a reminder of the invitations that we didn't get, broken relationships, broken families. It's a reminder of our loneliness, of our singleness. It's a reminder of lost and broken relationships. It's a reminder of the numbness and distraction and materialism that we can't help but turn to over and over and over again. And so on the brink of a season like this, how in the world are we supposed to be a people who in the midst of grief, in the midst of loss, in the midst of brokenness, disappointment, and doubt, point to a reality of God's kingdom of love and peace? Well, it begins and ends here with this statement. Redemption Church, you are not alone. God is with you. God does not leave us to survive on our own. In verse 25, Jesus speaks. And in his speaking, he reorients them, he reminds them, he restories them. See, the beautiful thing about this passage is they had gotten all the data right. All the facts about Jesus' death and resurrection were correct. And yet they found themselves in this state of grief, in this place of resentment, as now one calls it. And so what Jesus does is he speaks into that. And he brings it to life in a way that was different, that changes everything about what they already knew. And so in verse 25, Jesus says to them, "You foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to come into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things written about himself in all the scriptures. Jesus was with them, and Jesus was speaking to them, even when they didn't know it. And this is what I want to assure you of today. As someone whose job is to stand up and speak on behalf of God, God is with you, and God is speaking, even when you can't hear it. Even when you don't know it, even when you can't see it, it's happening. Christ encounters them. And Christ encounters you. And in the same way that Christ joins them on their journey, Christ is and has and will join you on yours. And look at verse 28. As they approached the village where they were going, he gave the impression that he was going further. Jesus is being a little cheeky here. And so they strongly urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it's getting toward evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in and he stayed with them. And even here, they still don't see him yet. And yet, he calls their attention to this true story that they're living into, the true story that God is inviting them in, the true story that God is embracing all of the world into. In verse 30, it came about when he had reclined at the table with them He took the bread and he blessed it and he broke it and he gave it to them. And it was only then that their eyes were opened. In communion, and the breaking and the blessing of the bread and the sharing of the wine, they see Jesus. Their eyes were open and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Now, for those of us who grew up reading the Bible the way that I did, we're like, well, Luke recorded that because that's what happened, right? So Luke is a good historian and he's recording history. Yeah, but also Luke is sort of a pastor here. And what Luke is trying to communicate to the early church in the first century is, even though you cannot see him, in the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the wine, he is with you. Even though you cannot observe him, he's there. Maybe even more fully than he was before. And so they said to one another in verse 32, were our hearts not burning within us when he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us? And so as they sit and eat with him, Jesus' presence with them transforms them. They don't need to follow what Jesus gives them, 5 rules to a better life. Well, I don't know, have you read my book? I signed it, here's a copy. They are moved simply by being in his presence, even when they're not aware of it. And they're moved from these isolated survivalists to what? Beloved companions. Now, I recently learned this, and so I'm obsessed with this fact. I did not know this up until now. Companion is I think it comes from French. I don't know. Fact check me with AI later. It comes from something that's not English, and it's to share bread with. And isn't that perfect? That what God is doing for the world, and this I think is exactly what Paul has in mind in Romans 5, is he has taken those who are trying to make God their enemies, and he is finding a way to transform them into people who he will share a meal with. Companions, friends. And so we are beloved companions. This move reminds us that we're not alone, but that more than that, we're actually loved. And so in this, God moves us from weary, burdened travelers with questions, with quarreling, with disillusionment, with doubt, with grief, to beloved companions of God. From resentment to gratitude, as now one puts it. From hardened hearts to burning hearts. In a Jesus-centered life, we find that our lives are transformed into grateful lives. Now, here's the key. In worship, we encounter Jesus, and our lives of resentment are restored by Jesus, and our worship together helps us encounter the one who will open our eyes to see this, that he is traveling with us, that when we leave here, we do not leave here alone, even if we are alone. That God goes with us on our journey out of this place as our companion. We walk out of here with this resounding truth. We are beloved. And gratitude is the result of our conversion into the heart of God's new way of being in the world. God's way of being a beloved child of God in the world versus someone who has to scratch and claw to survive. And this is the miraculous mark left on the otherwise resentful heart that has been transformed by God's love for us. Now, your temptation will be to hear me saying, well, you'd better be more grateful. You know, all that bad stuff, it's really not so bad. Have you considered how many people have it worse? Just look on the bright side. But that's not what I'm saying at all. The fact is, even in your aloneness, you will still feel alone, but you are not alone. Even in your grief, you will still feel and carry your grief, but the God of hope is with you. You are not alone, you are deeply loved, and you are able, with God's help, to become the sort of person who lives a grateful life, who lives a life that sees all the world as a gift, in spite of all the things that tell you otherwise. See, gratitude is God's gift to us. I can tell you, this is the sort of sermon that someone like me, especially given the last couple of years of my life, would punch me in the face for preaching. I personally have wanted to wallow in some of my own self-pity, and it's well justified. I have lots of reasons to feel sorry for myself, y'all. They're good ones, I promise. And yet the God of love says, this is not the best you. This is not what I've called you into. This is not the end of the story. And what I've found is the more I lean into that, in spite of all the losses, in spite of life going differently than I wanted it to, in spite of all the things that I'll never get to have because of X, Y, and Z, I do find that my heart melts in the presence of God's loving or warm, loving embrace of me. And that this is not something that I muster, but something that I find is mustered in me when I allow an awareness of God to kind of seep in. And so this is something that springs forth from my being loved by God. And my prayer is that it would be something that springs forth from your being loved by God. Not from trying harder, not from like writing out thank yous. Those are great things to do. You should practice them if you want. But what I'm talking about is a great transformative, miraculous work of God. And see, what happens is when we are transformed from resentment to gratitude, we begin to see the world differently. And so what happens is, as God's beloved children, instead of being people of scarcity, we see what we lack. We become aware of the sharp, I would add personally, sometimes painful beauty and goodness in all that we have. Some of the moments where I've felt that God has been closest to me have been the moments that have been the most painful. Not because God was there, but because life was there. And in these moments, it was like God ripped through the veil and reminded me, even here, even now, I'm with you. There is goodness and beauty all around us. God has not stopped being God. God continues to pour forth from God's self life and goodness and love and beauty. And number two, as God's beloved, we are no longer bitter, but our hearts are warmed and we're filled with joy. We see all of life around us transformed into a gift of beauty and delight. And suddenly, all of life is not a threat, but all of life is something that we can actually enter into and enjoy. Can you imagine a God whose great purpose for you is to enjoy? To enjoy God, to enjoy one another, to enjoy life. As God's beloved, in a life filled with gifts to be enjoyed, relationships suddenly are no longer utilitarian. But they become beautiful gifts, gifts of companionship, fellow bread sharers that we can enjoy together in our journeying alongside one another. And as God's beloved in the life filled with gifts to be enjoyed and relationships to be enjoyed, we can now see the people for what's there rather than seeing what's not there. Right, so what I mean by this is we enjoy people for who they are and what they bring, rather than being aware of what they're not bringing to the table. Maybe I should say it more bluntly. We enjoy people for who they are, rather than trying to enjoy people or to make them what we wish they were. We become people free to enjoy and delight in people for their own sakes. Able to say in this moment, let's just enjoy one another. Someone that I think puts a fine point on this, he's a pastor named Sam Wells, and he talks about growing up as a teenager, watching his mother die. And in those moments, what he wanted to do was try and fix her. try and do all these things for her, but there was nothing that he could do. And his whole life of ministry goes back to this trauma that he experienced as a child where he just didn't sit and enjoy his mother more. I think so much of life could be filled with more gratitude if we would just sit and enjoy people as they were. Finally, as God's beloved, we can enter into the glory of God's great future. Because what we do when we live these lives of gratitude, where we live lives where we are loved, that then freely love others, we realize that what we're doing is living out the kingdom of God. We're living out this glimpse of the feast that we join in together. And a Jesus-centered life takes the messes of our lives, the broken dreams, unfulfilled plans, all of our disappointments and doubts, and God receives all of us as we are, and in return, gives us the fullness of God's self. A life where God transforms us from isolated survivalists to God's beloved companions. Beloved people with beloved lives that are transformed into lives of gratitude.